Hi, Michael Batchelard here, the host of Trial by Water. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know how you can access the final episode of Trial by Water, episode 5, right now. If you're already a subscriber to The Age or the Sydney Morning Herald, simply search Trial by Water, episode 5, or go to theage.com.au or smh.com.au/podcast/trialbywater. If you're not a subscriber to The Age or Sydney Morning Herald, you can sign up there in seconds. Otherwise, the final episode of Trial by Water will be available in your podcast app of choice on Saturday, July 6th. Okay, on to today's episode. In the story of Robert Farquharson, there's one thing that's the hardest to understand. It's the thing that the general public and the media found they just couldn't accept about him. And it's what made the police in the first hours of their investigation believe that there was something terribly wrong with the story he'd told of coughing and passing out. This was to become the sixth strand of the evidence against Robert Farquharson, and in many ways, it's the most important. It was his behaviour during the crash and in the minutes and hours that followed. Because more than the technicalities of how his car got from the road to the dam, more than the scepticism over cough syncope or the emotional power of the car sinking video, and more even than the witnesses, it was Farquharson's own disturbing behaviour that turned police and the community against him. On that night, his actions seemed so far outside normal behaviour for a father that they must point inevitably to him having murdered his 3 sons. In the formal interview with police, it was the subject that preoccupied them more than anything else. But what does all this really tell us? And does it point with certainty to Robert Farquharson's guilt? Or is there some other explanation for his unsettling behaviour that night? From the newsrooms of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, this is Trial by Water. I'm Michael Batchelard, and this is episode 4, The Dad Test. A couple of days ago, the beginning of this episode sounded different to what you're about to hear. If you'd listened a couple of days ago, you'd have heard the sound of a tape recorder switching on, police officers unzipping folders. You'd have heard me describe Robert Farquharson waiting in a small, grim-looking room in the Victoria Police Homicide Squad headquarters, preparing to give his formal interview less than 48 hours after the 3 boys drowned. Then you'd have heard the voices of the 2 police officers, Gerard Clancy and Andrew Stamper. You'd have heard their sighs, the way the 3 men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. You'd have heard the emotion in Robert Farquharson's voice as he answered their questions. You'd have felt the tension in the room. But you're not going to hear those things, because Victoria Police have said they think it would be illegal for us to play you this 19-year-old recording. We fundamentally disagree. But they say it's not just illegal, but a criminal offence. On the police's view, Ruby and I, as journalists, could go to jail for 2 years for playing this recording in the Australian state of Victoria. But we still want you to know what happened in this interview, because it represents a crucial waymarker in this triple murder case. It shows how squarely focused police were on the 6th strand of evidence, on Farquharson's demeanour.
All right, so just go whenever, is that it?
Yes.
All right, cool.
So instead of the actual recording, we've used an old transcript released by the court, and we've asked some voice actors, actually a couple of colleagues who agreed to stay back late one night after the police threat arrived, to read out parts of the interview.
This is a tape-recorded interview between Detective Acting Senior Sergeant Gerard Clancy and Robert Donald William Farquharson. Robert, do you agree the time is now 3:07 p.m?
Yeah, that's correct.
The interview goes for more than 80 minutes, and the police keep coming back to a handful of questions. The first is, what did he try to do to save the boys? Why didn't he do more?
Did you do anything in relation to helping the boys?
I think, like I said, he opened the door, water come in and everything was just so quick.
Did you help with seatbelts?
I don't know if Jay had undone his or not. I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
Okay, what about you? Did you do anything?
I think I undone mine. Said just, wait, I'm trying to get out of here or something. I don't know, I don't know.
And they also seem to be fishing for a reaction, some emotion, something to indicate whether he's a grieving father or a cold killer.
How do you feel about what's happened?
Pretty shithouse. They're my life, my world.
It's there, sort of.
I blacked out. That's the honest truth. I got no lies. I got no reason to lie. I'd do anything to have them back, and I've got to live with this for the rest of my life, that I could not save my kids. I had 2 arms and 2 legs. I can't save 3. How was I supposed to do it? I tried and I tried and I tried.
How did you try, though?
I went around, I swam to the road to get people to help me.
Farquharson had previously told police that he'd dived down 3 or 4 times to try to find the car. But it turns out he can't even really be sure of this.
Did you dive down to try and find the car at all?
I tried. I think it was really black, and I know I went down somewhere, but where it was, I don't recall exactly. It was all so quick.
Over the months that I've been researching this story, so many people I've spoken to come back to these questions. It's often men saying, if I couldn't save them, I'd have gone down with them. Wouldn't you at least remember this? The desperation, the diving, calling out their names, if that's what you actually did? Then, once Farquharson escaped the car and reached the highway, the 2 men who stopped to help him, Shane Atkinson and Tony McClelland, offered to dive in to look for the kids. Shane recalls Farquharson saying, "No, just take me to Cindy. Come on, get me back."
Why did you want to go to Cindy?
To get help. I had no phone, nothing to ring anyone or anything. Not that that was my concern. I don't know why. I said I need to tell her, look, we've had an accident, or take me to the police. I don't know. She was probably the first thing I thought of. I don't know. I can't answer that.
What you're saying is your first thought was to tell your wife, not to get help.
To get help.
And then, why didn't he think to call 000 or ask someone else to?
You finally flagged down a car that stopped.
Yeah.
Did you ask that man to call the police?
I can't recall. I think I said something like, me kids are in the car or something.
Did you ask him if he had a mobile? Do you remember asking him?
No, I didn't.
You definitely didn't?
I can't remember because I was in shock.
The detectives then turned to the question of how he'd acted on the side of the dam while others were searching for the boys. Cindy Gambino, their mother, behaved how you'd expect a parent to act after learning that they'd just lost their 3 children. Remember that anguished 000 call from the first episode? But Farquharson couldn't really point to anything useful he'd done. As other men dived into the dam to try to find the car, people described Farquharson standing on the bank, arms crossed. Cindy said later, after she'd turned against him, that he looked like a man who'd lost his pushbike. Also, he kept pestering others for cigarettes, including Cindy's new partner Stephen Mools, one of the people who was diving.
When you got back there, what did you do?
I tried to look around to see where it was, where it happened, and to try to find, but couldn't find.
What were you looking for?
To see where the car was.
And how did you do that?
Just tried to look around, the lake, because she said, where'd you come from? I don't really recall, it's all a blur.
And as with everything in Farquharson's telling, it's got gaps. I don't know, he says. I don't recall. It's all blurry. You don't feel like you're getting a straight answer to what seems like an obvious question. Why didn't you do more? And remember, this formal interview took place less than 48 hours after police spoke to Farquharson in hospital, where he'd shed no tears, and instead of asking after the children, he seems more preoccupied with himself.
I know if it was me in that situation, I believe that if my children weren't here today, I wouldn't be here today.
Speaking to 60 Minutes in 2007, Stephen Wools expressed with crystal clarity how he believed Farquharson had failed.
Because if I couldn't save them, I'd huddle around them and say, well, we're going together, kids. And that's all there is to it.
This, Stephen is saying, is how a real man would have responded. But it's not just him. The rescuers and ambulance officers at the dam, followed by the police and investigators, and then the media and the broader community, men and women, ended up of almost one mind. Put simply, Robert Farquharson failed the dad test. "5 years later, at his second trial, Farquharson took the stand and gave evidence. Under heavy cross-examination, he was hit with repeated questions about the details of his story. For example, when he was picked up at the side of the road, he'd apparently speculated that he must have done a wheel bearing to get from the road to the dam. In cross-examination, this was said to be a whole different and incompatible version of his story. And still, the gaps remained. The "I don't knows" and the "it was so quicks." Helen Garner said the defence case never recovered. The jury just didn't like or trust Farquharson. The prosecutor in that case, Andrew Tinney, told the jury, "If he was really a loving father, the victim of a shocking accident, would he have really felt the imperative of seeing his ex-wife to the exclusion of all other things? What a delicious reward for him if he had murdered these children out of vindictiveness, out of a desire for vengeance. What a delicious reward to be able to be the one who would personally deliver the news, the devastating news of the death of those children." These actions seemed to Tinney and two juries, and finally the appeal court judges, to demonstrate a man warped utterly out of shape by hatred, violence and revenge. There's no denying that all that behaviour on the night the children died was strange and confronting. But I want to know, can it actually support the conclusions the prosecutor was drawing?
A really important principle about traumatic events is that you can't predict when you're in that state what you're going to do. And many people have told me that they've done very stupid things.
That's Dr. Rob Gordon. He's a clinical psychologist who specialises in trauma. He gave expert evidence for the defence in Farquharson's second trial.
I've had plenty of people describe their own or family members' behaviour, say fleeing a bushfire, where they lose the plot completely and start behaving in a way that afterwards they feel deeply ashamed of. They went entirely into their own self-protection. And other people in the situation had to take control, sometimes even children, and save their lives.
Our knowledge of the effects of trauma has increased enormously in recent years, and Rob Gordon is probably the best person in the country to tell us how. For more than 35 years, he's been working with traumatised people after natural disasters, shootings, suicides, even in the aftermath of the Port Arthur massacre in 1996. Rob Gordon can't say if Farquharson is guilty or not, but he's seen the police record of interview and plenty of the evidence about his behaviour, and
he's showing how unpredictable people are when they experience severe trauma. No, I didn't see a monster there. I saw a very disorganised man who was having a lot of trouble being coherent about his experience.
To Rob Gordon, Farquharson comes across as a man who's not connected to his own emotional life, who perhaps even lacks the language to express complex emotions. Also, Rob says this man has faced his own death and witnessed the deaths of his children. Having no idea what to do about it, or even really what happened, is consistent with a strong trauma response.
One of the very characteristic responses to trauma is dissociation.
Dissociation is a condition where people's minds stop handling information properly, and they often become disconnected from their feelings and memories.
Sometimes a person becomes so dissociated that they're not oriented to the physical environment, but we also know that people can dissociate from, say, the emotional consequences of an experience.
Trauma could explain why Farquharson's story was so gappy and unconvincing.
We also know that under conditions of high trauma, memories become fragmented and incoherent.
Rob says it seems as if Farquharson has watched his children dying, which explains why his attempts to find them at the side of the dam seem so inadequate.
They're diving to try and save them, but he knows that's impossible. His position is he's already accepted, as I understand it, that his children are dead.
And this is hard to hear, but the brutal reality is that Farquharson was right. It only takes seconds or minutes at most for a child to drown. His boys would have been dead before Farquharson had even reached the edge of the dam to try to flag down a car for help. And nobody found the car until much later that night. It was only when a police diver bumped into it with her head. She was using a specialist technique, an arc search pattern. It was pitch dark, 11 p.m, and she was searching 7.4 metres down. Rob says trauma could also explain why Farquharson's only thought was to see Cindy.
He was in a disorganised and despairing state and was as much wanting comfort from her rather than intending to hurt her.
And why he so badly wanted cigarettes.
He didn't do that with the attitude of someone who didn't care about what was happening. He did it with the attitude of someone who was overwhelmed and completely despairing and out of it and needing the comfort of cigarettes.
And what does Rob say about one of the most difficult to understand parts of all this? The fact that at his first interview with police at the hospital, Farquharson seemed more concerned with himself than his sons.
Perhaps we could say it might not be a very admirable quality, but he's reverted to a sort of instinctive survival of himself. What's going to happen to me? Okay, the children have gone. What's going to happen to me? They're all evidence of, let's say, a very egocentric personality. But I don't think they point inevitably to the notion that this man has carried out the plan to murder his children.
But what about if he'd murdered them? How would that affect Farquharson's behaviour afterwards?
If he had intended to kill them and succeeded, his mind would have been more organised and coherent and more focused. He didn't come across as someone who had intended to do something and succeeded. He came across as somebody whose whole life had been disrupted by something that was very hard to comprehend.
Now, all this begs another question. Could a person who's committed a crime, killed their children deliberately, also be traumatised by that? It's actually a question that occurred to the jury when Rob Gordon gave evidence in trial number 2, so the judge put it to him.
And when I was asked that, I said, yes, of course, they may well be.
But Rob says in the cases he's seen, the trauma of a murderer looks nothing like that of an accident victim.
It was like, what was traumatic is I've done this. And I think that's very different from what we see, which is Mr. Farquharson's case, which is I really can't grasp what's happening and I'm reverting to a very simple, self-centred, what's going to happen to me next.
I respect Rob Gordon's expertise, but so much of what he's just said doesn't pass the sniff test, right? I hear all that, but I still look at Farquharson's actions and think, I'd do better than that. Anyway, I was in the middle thinking about all this, and then the first episode of the podcast came out, and I got a text message from Jeffrey Ferguson. Remember him? He was the truck driver we spoke to in episode 2. He coughed and passed out and spent 2 years in jail because his truck ran into a car and killed a man. I mean, it was more of an essay than a text message, to be honest, but Jeff had been thinking about Farquharson's behaviour at the side of the dam too, and it reminded him of himself, standing at the side of that road with a dead man in a car, a death that he'd caused but kind of not caused because he'd been unconscious. Anyway, the message said, I remember wondering in a clinical kind of way what would happen to me moving forward, not because I was insensitive to the fact that the other man was dead, but because I had already accepted that he was dead, and my mind analytically moved on to what happens next. He'd already accepted he was dead. Jeffrey's using exactly the same language here as Rob Gordon. So, can trauma explain everything about Farquharson's behaviour that night? Is this analysis enough to exonerate him? Rob Gordon asks a different question.
If you ask me, did he do it? The kind of evidence I would want is to know, how did he deal with emotional crises before? Had he had any other serious events in his life? And if so, was there any evidence about how he reacted emotionally? What was his emotional style?
They don't know Rob. They don't know him from a bar of soap.
In your mind, did he do it?
No.
He is innocent.
I believe he is. I believe this is a tragic accident.
For 4 years, despite all the evidence arrayed against him, Cindy Gambino continued to believe her husband to be innocent. And this raises questions for me. Farquharson insisted to the police, and he maintains to this day that the children were his life. But police and prosecutors painted a picture of a man so indifferent towards them and so calculating that he could kill them to get back at his ex-wife for ending their marriage, then successfully hoodwink her for 4 years about what he'd done. Was he capable of this? Or was he, as Rob Gordon suggested, just disconnected from his emotional life? I mean, who is this man really?
As a kid, he was quiet, unassuming, kind, loved animals. There's always an animal under the arm or running around near his feet somewhere.
Farquharson's big sister, Carmen Ross, is a staunch supporter of her brother. She paints a picture of a childhood with some bumps along the way.
He was a prem baby. He had turned eyes, so he had to have corrective surgery on the eyes as a young kid. Broke his leg, a lot of little injuries like that. So in one way, he was behind the 8 ball.
They were raised in a pretty traditional household.
Dad's very old-fashioned. He would have his tea in the lounge room watching the news because it was peaceful, and, the noisy kids had to be banned to the kitchen to eat and that.
And they were not very well off.
Yeah, money was tight, but we just accepted it.
As for young Robert, she paints him, above all, as amenable. The youngest of 4 children in a family Carmen describes as yellers and fighters. He just enjoyed the company.
We all had to share that TV, so we all had to agree what we were watching, and he just didn't get a choice. So he was very adaptable to family situations and...
Amenable, would you say?
Oh, more than that, just easygoing.
At school and in the workforce, he wasn't driven, Carmen says.
He didn't have any burning ambition to have that thing in your life you want to do when you leave school. Really didn't care whether he was a brickie or a waiter or poured petrol.
But she says he loved being married and having children and supporting his family.
He was like the doting dad and mum.
Mark Bean worked with him at the Cumberland Resort in Lorne, where Farquharson, nicknamed Farky, was a cleaner. Inevitably, football was the other feature of their relationship.
He was just like a normal dad at the footy with his kids, but he was prepared, unlike me. He was always the dad there with a backpack with a change of clothes, and if any of them got in the mud, Robbie would clean them up and have a new set of clothes for them and everything like that. And he was the doting dad.
Michael Hart was another friend.
He just did everything for the kids. That was his life, his boys. He was a better father than I was. And I have no problems admitting to that.
You'll remember that Farquharson dropped over to see Michael the night the boys died to ask him to join them for their special meal at KFC in Geelong. Michael said no because he was feeling sick. Mark Bean, the former workmate, reckons Farquharson was a bit of a joker.
Sort of knock-around bloke, really. He had a bit of fun, bit of a shit stir at work. Yeah, no, He was quite an amusing bloke.
And perhaps he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed.
I don't know how overly smart Rob is.
I asked Carmen about this and she got a little defensive. I mean, we've had some friends, one friend of his, a workmate, describe him as he didn't think he was all that smart.
I think he was wise.
Here's Mark Bean again.
Rob's a pretty simple bloke. Do you know what I mean? So he probably needed a little bit of guidance.
When Mark talks about guidance, he's saying what many people, including Cindy herself, pointed out, that she ruled the roost at home.
I think the best way to describe Rob and Cindy's relationship is that Rob loves Cindy unconditionally, did whatever he could to make her happy, whatever she wanted, he tried to get.
That's Wendy Kennedy. She delivered the eulogy at the kid's funeral, and she spoke about Farquharson on the ABC's Australian Story in 2011. She was Cindy's best friend from school.
So Cindy just got what Cindy wanted, basically.
Out of all this, some speculated that Farquharson had been dominated his whole life by women. Firstly, his bossy older sisters, as Helen Garner described them in her book, This House of Grief. And later, by Cindy. Actually, it comes through quite a lot in the Helen Garner book, is that, he's sort of this kind of small guy. He's got a couple of bossy older sisters. Then he moves on to a bossy wife that he's kind of squashed, downtrodden, and that he's murdered his children out of some explosion of male rage at all this suppression. Is any part of that ring true to you?
Absolutely not. Look, I describe myself as a bossy sister, but no, I'm not. Look, I don't think Cindy was any bossier than any other person. I think he listened to women and what we had to say, and doesn't have any of that, I just don't see it.
Doesn't have any of that what?
That rage or frustration or, felt that they'd been hard done by. He enjoyed where he was. He loved being a dad. He liked being a husband. He loved having a family.
But what about when he lost that, after Cindy asked him to leave? Here's Mark Bean again.
Initially, when they first split, there was, he was bitter and a bit twisted about it all. And I think the thing that got to him probably most was that, he'd still be going to work, he'd still be doing all that. He wasn't in the house, this other guy had moved in, and he used to articulate quite freely about him driving his Commodore and how he wasn't happy about it.
Remember, Farquharson started taking antidepressant medication about a year before the crash, after Cindy met Stephen Moulds and their marriage hit trouble. Actually, Cindy says by this time, Farquharson had already been depressed for a few years, since his mother got cancer in 2000.
What did you notice about your husband?
He was always down and out. I think he grieved for his mum before she died.
She died in 2002, and Carmen says it wasn't a nice death. But by late 2005, both Farquharson and his doctors said that things had smoothed out after counselling and the medication. Farquharson was asked about his mental health in his police interview, and about suicide. They asked if he'd ever thought about hurting himself. He said he'd had a little glimpse of it at the start, but that it passes. You realise it's not really you, he says. In their first statements to police, Cindy and even Stephen agreed things had got better in the latter half of 2005. Mark Bean remembers the same thing.
Probably for the last two and a half months before it happened, that's when he sort of stopped being bitter and twisted about what had gone on, and he's looking forward to doing things with his boys.
He said he was angry, but he was dealing with that. He'd go for walks. The fact he was going to counselling, I think that's really good. I just think he handled that breakup really well and very maturely.
And as we've heard, Cindy spent 4 years supporting her ex. Once she flipped, though, she turned hard. During his second trial, she and her supporters wore purple to court, the colour of domestic violence awareness. When Farquharson's lawyer showed her a famous photograph of them crying and supporting each other at the children's funeral, she screwed it up and threw it on the floor in front of the witness box. And out in Winchelsea, someone tried to scratch Robert Farquharson's name off the boy's headstone. When Farquharson's lawyer asked Cindy if she had anything to do with this, she shot back at him, "You disgust me." You get the picture. Things got heated. There aren't many interviews with Cindy during this time. This one comes from Crimes That Shook Australia.
He was always looking for where my car was and who I was with. It was not a nice feeling.
Stephen described this as showing he had obsessive, maybe even possessive thoughts.
There was a moment a few days before, it was a Wednesday night, and he rang me and he wasn't doing very well. He was really depressed, and I spoke to Stephen's mother about it, and she said, just watch out. That pricked my ears up. But I thought he was suicidal, not homicidal.
This was about the worst of what Cindy had to say about her ex-husband. On the night of the crash, Carmen Ross was one of the people who turned up to see Farquharson in the hospital. She loves her brother. She's convinced he's innocent, so she's inclined to see the positives wherever she can. But even she struggles to explain the behaviour that she saw that night.
Yeah, it does appear strange. I don't know what anyone in that situation, how are they supposed to act? I just don't understand. I don't have an answer, but I know that my feeling is that I can understand people confused about that.
Other aspects of his response she finds easier to explain, like his desire to go straight to Cindy.
As a parent and as a wife, I actually can understand that, because the person who is closest, that would understand, and the person you need to tell the most is the parent of that child. But I guess the reality is it wouldn't have made a difference. You know, the car went down, the boys went down, and it was all over in seconds, minutes. So we all wish and what ifs and if we could change the thing, but it wouldn't change. And for him to have to go through that is just horrible. Any parent to witness it, being there and not being able to save their children, it's just so unimaginable, so horrible.
But how much does all this tell us, really? I've been talking to friends who think he was over the grief of the breakup, his sister who stands by him. And we've heard this sort of thing before in other contexts. We've heard of people who were seemingly upright citizens who've been violent and coercive behind closed doors. Was this the real Robert Farquharson? Did he fit the mould of a murderer? To try to work that out, I'm going to have to call someone else, an expert in the people who kill their children. That's after the break. If you want to understand if there's a sort of person who's predisposed to murdering family members, Dr. Xanthi Mallett's the person to talk to. She's a forensic anthropologist, author, criminologist and associate professor at the University of Newcastle. Parents accused of killing their children are her specialty.
Xanthi Mallett.
Oh, good day, Xanthi. Michael Batchelard here. So one afternoon, I gave her a call. Do you have a moment or are you flat chat?
Yeah. Oh, well, I'm walking the dog at the moment, so I'm multitasking.
Oh, very good. Well, do tell me if you need to go throw a stick or something.
Sure.
Her book, Mothers Who Murder and Infamous Miscarriages of Justice, explored the case of Kathleen Folbig, among others. Folbig spent 20 years in jail for murdering 3 of her children and the manslaughter of the 4th. Her conviction was quashed last year after an inquiry found the evidence against her just didn't stack up. I don't want to give you too many details about the story because I kind of want to get an archetype answer from you, if that's okay.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean.
So that you're not kind of contaminated
Led
by the
by the
facts of the case
information,
or by your... I don't want Xanthi's knowledge or preconceptions about Farquharson's case to prejudice her answer, but I've got to give her enough information so she gets the idea. The man is convicted of killing his children on Father's Day, and this case seems unusual partly because there's no priors, there's no violence, there's no coercion or control in the relationship.
None reported or none actually? Because we know that's not the same thing.
No, I understand that. But in this one, even his enemies, even his wife who gave evidence against him.
Oh,
said,
really? So she accepts that he killed the children but confirms that there was no DV or family violence?
Correct.
Right. And so you say there was no violence, but in terms of how did the children die?
They died in what the defence said was an accident and what the prosecution said was a deliberate act.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how usual is it for somebody with no history like that to turn and then kill 3 children?
Well, I would say that I've never seen it when there's no history like that. So when somebody is killed, especially in like domestic homicide, and then the police go, there was no history of domestic violence, it just means it wasn't reported. I always say people never go from 0 to 100 in one step. It doesn't happen unless they have some sort of psychiatric break, but then there would be a history or at least a diagnosis of mental health issues. I'm talking like serious ones like schizophrenia or something.
Yeah.
So I've never seen somebody go from 0 to 100 ever.
Xanthi has been researching child murderers for more than a decade. When I ask her how many cases she's looked into, she can't tell me. It's too many. And her response is unequivocal. She has never seen a case where someone has gone from 0 to 100. So this is the case, you may or may not know it, of a guy called Robert Farquharson.
I know the name. How long ago did this happen?
Eventually, I tell Xanthi about the case I'm looking at. The incident was 2005.
Okay.
I wanted to know the specifics. And he made his way to the highway and kind of rejected offers of help. And the thing he wanted to do was go and tell his wife, Cindy, about it. And his words were that I've killed the kids.
I mean, that doesn't look good, got to say.
No. As I begin to provide a clearer picture of what happened and the events that led up to the crash. Yes, they'd separated and she'd started another relationship.
Right, which can be a trigger.
That can be a trigger, that's right. And it seems like Xanthi might be changing her mind. He was angry about that, quite publicly angry about that.
Right.
That the more she learns, the more she's asking herself, does this guy fit the profile of someone who'd kill their children? But then she asks me some clarifying questions.
I mean, was there any other triggers? Had they had a massive row or anything like that?
No, not at all. He didn't like the new partner and he didn't like the way that...
Well, you know, that goes with the territory, doesn't it? Does anyone ever like their ex's new partner? You know, he wasn't, I don't know, hadn't begun gambling a lot or kind of showing those risk-taking behaviours?
Not at all. There was a little bit of money pressure.
That's normal.
Generated by the split. They were selling a house together. And
that's always awkward. Been there, yeah.
He was driving around in the better car and he got what he called a shit car.
Oh, well, yeah, these are normal kind of break-up things, though, aren't they?
Eventually, Xanthi returns to the points she made originally.
I mean, as I said, it is unusual people to go from 0 to 100 without any warning signs. And I'm not saying it's impossible because people are obviously unique, but in my experience, I haven't seen somebody go from nothing to killing their family. That's a pretty extreme leap.
Now, a little while after I spoke to Xanthi, I learned about the incident that Cindy described after she'd turned against Farquharson, where she says he pushed her up against the wall in the hallway of their house during an argument. We talked about that in episode 1, and Farquharson has a different memory of the incident. But I want to ask Xanthi if that suggested he was escalating in violence, and whether it would change her view.
Would that change my view? It's difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I'm not diminishing the seriousness of it. Any physical violence, threat of violence is unacceptable. That would be low down on a scale of violence, though. And I would certainly expect to see a more serious escalation before the outcome that we saw in this case. So, yeah, I mean, that's low level.
Then Xanthi asks me a question, and it flummoxes me.
Surely he was assessed by psychs for the court. I presume you had psych assessments, etc.
That is a really good question. I don't think he was. I've seen most of the files and I do not see a psych assessment.
That would be weird.
Weird as in?
Well, I mean, if they're saying that this was because of basically psychological pressure and all of that, then I would definitely have expected a psych report, probably one for the prosecution, one for the defence.
That's never occurred to me before, but of course, there should be a psych report.
Well, yeah. Surely if it hinges on that, i.e. his mental state, how have they not assessed his mental state?
Where's the psych report? This is not a small question. The Victorian courts have twice convicted an otherwise loving man of triple child murder. The prosecution in both trials argued that the motive was fury, revenge, vindictiveness. But at no point has the prosecution, or the defence for that matter, made an effort to prove what was going on in his head. The only evidence that points to the motive is that of Greg King, whose recollection of what he heard Farquharson say changed several times. Farquharson's own apparently callous actions at the dam side also suggested to some he was capable of murder. But where's the science? And how unusual in a case like this would it be for there not to be a psych report?
I don't know how unusual. I mean, you could ask Tim Watson-Monroe, who's a criminal psychologist. He's been doing this for over 40 years.
I get hold of Tim Watson-Monroe. Just get the recorder going. Tim Watson-Monroe, I've just sort of explained the outline of the case. And at first, I try to do the same thing with Tim as I did with Xanthi. I'm trying not to colour his view. This time, it doesn't work out so well.
It's not Robert Farquharson, is it, by any chance?
It is Robert Farquharson, yes.
There you go. I guess that nobody told me. It just came into my ether.
So I ask him straight out. What does he think about the fact that in this case no psych report was ordered?
I find that extraordinary. Given the magnitude, I mean, it's a triple murder, right? It's not just killing one person, but 3 died. And given what's on the table, I find it extraordinary. By way of example, I mean, I was involved in the Hoddle Street massacre. I had to work up.
He's referring to a mass shooting in 1987 when a former soldier, Julian Knight, stood on a busy Melbourne roadside at 9:30 p.m. one Sunday, aiming and shooting. He killed 7 people and injured 19 with a high-powered rifle.
I saw him, a forensic psychiatrist saw him, Dr. David Syme, Dr. Ken Burns saw him, a forensic psychologist, and I believe also Dr. Alan Bartholomew saw him, and Alan was the chief Crown psychiatrist for Victoria. And sure, Knight murdered 7, but you get the drift. It's pretty, I'm staggered that no psych report was tendered.
I felt like maybe I'd missed something, so I checked again. I looked through all the transcripts and documents. I checked with Farquharson's current lawyer, Luke McMahon, and his former lawyer, who declined to be interviewed for this series. Nothing. I was stunned. I had to tell Ruby. She said, well, what did the psych report say? And I was like, there's no psych report.
Is that right?
Well, it's not in any of the materials. I sent a Freedom of Information request to the police. I'll get that back sometime next year if I'm lucky. And I checked with one of Farquharson's friends. Finally, I got a message to him in prison to ask if he'd ever been assessed. The answer was still no. Just to be clear, the kind of report Xanthi and Tim are talking about is a series of comprehensive tests by forensic psychiatrists or psychologists. These reports often include personality testing to evaluate whether someone had an undiagnosed psychotic illness or was a psychopath. None of this was done. In its place, we have a police statement and a 3-page report from Farquharson's counsellor, Dr. Peter Popko. He's a psychologist who Farquharson had been seeing for about 8 months. most recently a month before the crash. Peter's statement said Farquharson was mildly depressed and medicated with a standard antidepressant. He was grieving for the end of his relationship with Cindy and angry with her seeing someone else. But according to Peter, this anger wasn't extreme or threatening, and Farquharson was grateful that Cindy gave him open access to the kids. Farquharson was making very good therapeutic progress in counselling and was starting to show interest in dating, but felt maybe it was still a bit too soon. His depression was mild. There was no persistent suicidal ideation, and he had the ability to hold down a job and to show enthusiasm for sporting activities, especially those which involved the children. My personal opinion, Peter told police, is that it is highly unlikely that Rob would have done anything to hurt his kids. There's only one more piece of evidence I managed to turn up about Robert Farquharson's psyche. It doesn't come from the crash scene or the lead up to it. This very brief statement comes from a psychologist in prison who saw Farquharson in 2011, about 3 years into his 33-year term. And this is what it said. We are either dealing with a man who is innocent and wrongfully imprisoned, or a man who is in denial. If Robert Farquharson failed the dad test, Lindy Chamberlain spectacularly failed the mum test. The question of Lindy's demeanour was at the centre of one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in Australian history.
During her appearances, she showed neither anger, grief or distress as she came and went from the courthouse each day.
She was cold, the story went. She lacked emotion.
If I smiled, I was belittling my daughter's death. If I cried, I was acting.
This is Lindy talking about her time in the spotlight of public hatred after her 10-month-old daughter Azaria was killed by a dingo at the campsite at Uluru in 1980.
The point is, until you go through something, you have no idea how you yourself will react.
And it was not just the public that was making these judgments.
Everybody in Darwin thought she was guilty. And I don't know whether it was the press, everything that we read about it. I think everybody just said, she's so guilty. She doesn't even cry.
That wasn't just anyone. That was a juror who judged her case in the Supreme Court murder trial. It turns out in the Northern Territory you can interview jurors. And a lack of emotion wasn't Lindy's only problem. She and her husband Michael did all sorts of things that under the spotlight just looked weird. Like, the day after Azaria disappeared, the couple posed for a photograph, and they were both smiling.
They're all smiling. And people say, well, how can that happen? That's just bizarre.
That's Stuart Tipple. He's a lawyer who first met the Chamberlains by chance one weekend in September 1981, and he defended them through trials, appeals, and 3 of the 4 inquests. Now he gives lectures about the case across the country, and at those lectures he always shows that photograph.
Now I actually show a photograph that was taken of the Chamberlains the morning after Azaria disappeared, when they'd made the decision there was no hope, let's go back to our home in Mount Isa.
It shows Michael and Lindy standing next to their car, like they're just about to set off on a road trip, only without the tiny baby who was snatched by a dingo just hours earlier. During his lectures, Stuart explains what he thinks is the story behind that photograph.
The reality is that when people, particularly photographers like the Chamberlains, get in front of a camera, there's just a natural reaction. You smiled. But yes, looking at that photograph, you could put your own interpretation on that, saying, how could you possibly be smiling in a photograph that's taken, less than 24 hours after your child's disappeared?
But the photograph was not the only apparently incriminating evidence against the Chamberlains. Like, half an hour after Lindy saw her baby being taken from their tent, Michael said to his fellow campers, "A dingo has taken our baby. She was 9 weeks old, and she's probably dead by now."
Demeanour was a big issue in the Chamberlain case.
They made limited efforts to join the search, and a few hours after Azaria went missing, They went off to stay in a motel.
They tried to say that the Chamberlains hadn't searched enough, hadn't searched long enough.
All this seemingly made it very hard to have sympathy for the Chamberlains, and very easy to draw the conclusion that they must be murderers.
I think the real danger is that people think that they can put themselves in that person's position and make a judgment call and saying, if that was me, I would act in this particular way. I wouldn't do that. Therefore, they must be guilty.
When Stuart read about the Farquharson case, those old familiar feelings returned.
I was really concerned and alarmed when I saw those same traits appearing in the prosecution of Farquharson.
The Australian legal system is supposed to protect you if you're under investigation. It's supposed to regard you as innocent. The onus of proof, that is, the responsibility of proving someone is guilty, is on the prosecution. But in a high-profile, horrific case, particularly one involving children, police come under immense pressure to find the culprit. And according to Tipple,
what's actually happened now is that onus is being reversed. And so with a person like Farquharson, a person like Chamberlain, they have no alternative, but they've got to prove their innocence.
And that is a dangerous position for an accused person to be in.
It all adds to this rope that ends up stringing up the poor accused in a circumstantial case.
Lindy Chamberlain was freed from prison 38 years ago and finally exonerated at an inquest 12 years ago. But the feeling that she must be guilty has a very long tail.
I've had people that have actually confronted me and say, look, she's guilty because of such and such. And then you demolish that and then say, well, what about this? And you demolish that and you demolish everything that they come up with. And then usually their parting shot is, it doesn't matter if she's got killer eyes.
After hearing how Robert Farquharson had behaved at the scene, many people made up their minds he was at least cold and a little inhuman, and at most a murderer. The way the media covered him, the unflattering photographs that appeared in the newspapers, the shifty sideways looks as he emerged from the court, seemed to confirm it. In his sentencing remarks, the judge, Lex Lasry, said, based on the arguments put to him, you were devoid of any interest or concern for your children or even for the recovery of their bodies. And Helen Garner? I really wanted to interview her for this series, but she declined. She sent me a lovely email, though. In it she said she didn't want to talk because this story was so irradiated with pain and loss and desperate grieving that I know I can't go back there. But we have her book. And throughout the trial, it shows her weighing the evidence and judging character and painting an electrifying picture of the characters in the courtroom. And after it all, what conclusion did she arrive at? If there is any doubt that Robert Farquharson drove into the dam on purpose, she wrote, it is a doubt no more substantial than a cigarette paper shivering in the wind. But that's not where she ends her book. She follows up her judgment by painting a picture of something that stuck in her mind from the case. Rereading it recently, I was surprised because the same scene had also stuck in mine. It's when Farquharson, on his trip into Geelong for his special Father's Day meal with the boys, stopped at the Kmart car park because little Bailey had fallen asleep. Instead of waking him, the father sat with the three boys in the car, listening to the footy on the radio until the 2-year-old awoke. I actually recalled that as a touching scene in which the father didn't want to disturb the smallest as he slept, so they all waited together. That's not how Garner described it on the last page of This House of Grief. This is what she wrote. The sad father sits with his boys in the shit car listening to the football. This clapped-out bubble of steel and glass is the only home he has to offer them. By nightfall, the shit car would become a weapon and then a coffin. For Robert Farquharson, the gate slammed on his freedom after the judge, Lex Lasry, passed his sentence in 2010. The appeal court confirmed this in 2012, saying that Farquharson's conduct meant it was simply beyond belief to argue the deaths were accidental. But now the fresh questions raised in this podcast, and by a range of scientists and experts about the strands of evidence in this case, offer Robert Farquharson one slim hope. He's still not halfway through his 33-year sentence, but new laws passed in Victoria in 2019 give him one final chance to appeal his case. And Luke McMahon, the sometime journalist who became obsessed with this case as a law student, has signed Farquharson up as a client. He wants to take these arguments back into the same court that 12 years ago resoundingly confirmed Farquharson's guilt. And this time, Luke hopes, he's armed with evidence that's fresh enough and compelling enough to see his client set free. That's next time on the final episode of Trial by Water. If you found any of the content in this episode distressing, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Trial by Water is a production of The Age and Sydney Morning Herald. It's hosted and reported by me, Michael Batchelard. Ruby Schwartz executive produced the series. She's also the head of investigative podcasts. Martin Peralta mixed the series. Editing from Patrick Elliott, The Age's editor, and Matthew Dunkley, the deputy and investigations editor. Additional reporting in this series from Nick McKenzie. Legal review by Sam White. Tom McKendrick is the head of audio and video. Chris Payne is the head of premium content. Special thanks to David McMillan and Martine Chaussard.